Hello, Carson Bible. My name is Seth Haak. I am an elder at the Well Church in Long Beach, and Pastor Chris asked me to share about 5 life-changing books with y'all. So it's my pleasure. There's a lot more, so it's a little, difficult task to narrow it down to those 5. But I want to go through a few that have a lot of personal significance to myself. The first one being Tim Keller's The Reason for God. And I'll start here kind of not lightweight, but this one has a lot of meaning to me personally. So after a long prodigal son walk, I came back to the church, but I still had a whole lot of questions. This was a great first step into apologetics. It's just a reasoned case for Christian God and Scripture, answering questions like, who is this God? Like, how can there be a good God, but there's still bad things in the world? So pretty basic fundamental questions, but it's written in a way that is very patient and also explained a lot of that. I love walking through the book with other seekers, or maybe even just like new Christians that are growing in their faith. Maybe even those who walked away from the church but are willing to have that discussion. It really deepened my walk in a way that made me realize it's okay to ask questions, to press in, to be hungry, to want to know, what we believe and why we believe it. Keller's got this scholarly style that really kind of personally appeals to my taste. I know it's maybe a little dry for some, but I really enjoy his other books as well as his, teaching curriculum and just his sermon style. So, talk through some of Redeemer Church's other, curriculum and stuff like that with small groups. Really enjoyed it. Would recommend it. Second book is John Stott's The Cross of Christ. This is more along kind of like the same thread with Reason for God. It's a deep dive into the meaning of, you guessed it, the cross. So he's really diving into topics like why is it so crucial to Christ's ministry? Why did Christ have to die? Forgiveness and satisfaction for sin, salvation for sinners, how God is revealed through the cross, and how evil is conquered, and what that all means for me and you as Christ followers. It really is like a microscopic view on the cross, and you're not going to get like that in-depth just in like a sermon or even just a series of sermons. It really is like very, very extremely in-depth and laser focused on that. It's pretty scholarly, but it's also, I'd say, like very accessible to read. It's very readable. And there's also this awesome section in there that has just this amazing deep dive into the Lord's Supper as the new Passover meal, which I thought was, kind of opened my eyes to how approaching that again, looking at, my own studies. Third book, also life-changing, Martin Lloyd-Jones studies in the Sermon on the Mount. It's looking at, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And the book itself is a series of transcripts of Lloyd-Jones's sermons as he was going through this series. I believe he went through the series for like a year and a half, something like that, with the congregation. And so it's based on his notes and parishioners' notes of his sermons as he was delivering them to the congregation. It's, I'd say like the most life-changing section, though, is probably just the very first section. So if you're intimidated by the size, the very first section just on the Beatitudes that Jesus goes through and that Lloyd-Jones deep dives into makes it worth just the read, even if you're only going to read just a small section of the book. Again, it's really like a microscope view, laser view focus that Lloyd-Jones takes, on each of these. Like each chapter is really just looking at like a verse or maybe half a verse or maybe just a phrase, but he goes really, really in depth, which could seem tedious, but the way that it's written and the way that Lloyd-Jones delivered it, it was a series of sermons, and so it's written almost like devotional style because you're reading him as he's reading a sermon. So each one is pretty life-giving, and it doesn't come off like overly scholarly, I would say. Which could be intimidating with a big fat book like this with very small print. Yeah, I would say that, like just going through like the first Beatitude section, looking at like what's that mean as a blessed citizen of the kingdom of heaven, what that should look like down to the core of our character, and not just the actions that citizen would do. All these descriptions are, going into depth on like how it's just so backwards to our natural tendency after the fall, and it's this upside down kingdom, and it was unheard of up to that day, and is still mind-boggling to this. So yeah, as I said, like each chapter really is a sermon, and so feels large, but it's easier to read if you just sit down and maybe read like a chapter at a time. Really enjoyed this study on that. My fourth book is Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Life Together. So this book is pretty cool. It's a short, simple, incredibly deep book. Bonhoeffer wrote this, I believe, in the 30s. It might have been earlier than that. But basically, he's writing like about the missional community movement, that we've had for the last 15 years or so. He was writing about that before it was cool, about 70 years before that even had like that name and the phrase. And the stuff he's talking in about, talking in here is, it's a breath of fresh air the way that he is approaching it. And so it's talking about like fellowship within the church, centered on Christ, daily Christian rhythms of being in the Word, in prayer, working out our faith together, doing things like eating meals together, singing together, praying together, laboring together, confessing with each other, taking communion together. The title should describe it as Life Together. It should make sense. And besides that, like you can even take this to your own family, and it builds in a nice rhythm, even as like a daily devotional kind of thing of like, okay, as a family at the breakfast table, we can build out a time where we are, talking with the kids, reading together through a piece of scripture, going through a psalm together, singing, praying together. Very simple, like building in these life rhythms as a Christian family. So that's some of the big stuff. He goes much more in depth, but I really would recommend it. This one is pretty easy to read. I like to read it like once a year or so, just as a refresher. It's just really, really good stuff in there, and it's convicting. We're not called to do life as lone wolves. We are adopted into this family so that we can, part of the benefit and the blessing is to be a family and be doing life together. And so it's great to keep our eye on the ball there. Final book here. Funny enough, the Chronicles of Narnia by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis had to be in the list somewhere, right? But this is, his fiction series. And it's not just The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. We picked up an edition where it's got all 7 of the books in that series. And so, this was just incredibly enjoyable. I read this to my daughter. I think we started it when she was 6. It took a couple months, reading the stories as bedtime stories. Loved it. Watched the movies afterwards. That was a whole ton of fun. It's incredibly inspiring as, I'm an artist myself, and so it's a breath of fresh air also to be able to read just a beautiful piece of, fiction fantasy written in a Christian perspective. Plenty of beautiful allegorical images that just make it so much easier in like the day-to-day topics. Just Jesus comes up naturally as we talk about, Aslan on the stone, like, that's just like Jesus, and so it brings in these really cool conversations with the kids because we're already talking about the story, and so it also reminds me of just like I can be both deeply passionate about theology and study of the Word and Scripture and nerd out on that, and also be able to take that and translate that in my own way with my own creative voice into my own storytelling. And so, really pointing back to that ultimate story and being able to speak some deeper truths through that. So, pointing back to the Scripture's bigger narrative of, the creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. So, those were my life-changing 5. Looking forward to, watching the rest of this series and seeing some other amazing books in here too. So, hope you're all blessed by that, and I'll see you all soon.